Good morning, everyone, or good evening, good afternoon, depending upon where you're located. Today's webinar will start in 2 minutes. The webinar is being recorded, and Lightful will send a link to the recording of the webinar within 24 to 48 hours of the end of the webinar. So we got about 90 seconds. All right, 60 seconds until we begin. All right, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. This is Heather Mansfield, the founder of Nonprofit Tech for Good. Thank you for joining today's webinar, How Nonprofits Can Make Their Fundraising Campaigns More Social. Today's webinar will probably take 45 to 50 minutes, and we will do a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. There is a questions module in GoToWebinar where you can send me questions throughout, and then I'll save those to present to our speaker at the end of the webinar. I did want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and Lightful, who's presenting today's webinar, will send a link to the recording 24 to 48 hours after the webinar is over. Today I'm very excited to announce and proud to announce we get really good speakers here at Nonprofit Tech for Good. Teresa Litza, who will be presenting today's webinar. She's the social media manager for Lightful, a social media management tool built specifically for nonprofits. She's also won some pretty impressive awards lately, so as I said, we're lucky to have her. She was named Community Manager of the Year from the Social Media Marketing Awards in the UK, and also a campaign that she helped create called Reclaim Social, which I believe happens February 6th every year, is a day about reclaiming social for positivity, reclaiming social back from the trolls and the mean people, and it's hashtag Reclaim Social. She also won an award for that campaign as the Campaign of the Year for Social Good. She's based in London where it's 6 p.m., so thank you very much, Teresa, for joining us and working after hours. And go right ahead, let's get started.
Hello, Heather. Hello, everyone. It's really great to be with you today. And as Heather said, I'm based in London, and it's really great to actually have everyone across the world. And today we're going to talk about making the most of your fundraising campaigns and how to make them more social. As Heather just said, my name is Teresa Litza. I'm a social media manager at Lightful, and I've been working in the social media and content marketing world for 7 years now. I've mostly delivered training and webinars the last 2 years with Lightful, so we're working with nonprofits and charities. And I'm passionate in general about using social media for good, which also comes from the idea of Reclaim Social. It was a campaign that we started running 2 years ago. And the message is very simple, making sure that nonprofits and individuals share their own positive messages using the hashtag Reclaim Social. I'm also having a podcast for the same reason, talking about inspiring causes and stories. It's the Reclaim Social podcast. And you can also follow me on Twitter, that I'm spending quite a lot of time. Just make sure you follow me if you want to and ask me more questions. As Heather mentioned, I'm working for Lightful, is a UK-based tech company for social good. There is a consultancy in terms of helping nonprofits make the most, but we've also built the first social media management platform for charities and nonprofits. So when you want to schedule your posts, get organized more with social media and other things that we're going to talk about, you can just try it out. And there's also a free version for those who feel that they don't really have the budget and still want to make the most of social media. Today, we're going to talk about the use of social media in fundraising. So we want to cover, first of all, the introduction. Why do we use social media in fundraising? And how can these two really work together? We're going to cover 4 different ways to involve social media to your supporter journey. And then we're going to look at the individual social platforms. How can you make the most of each different platform based on your objectives? We look at some additional tips, some of them more practical, other ideas on how to make fundraising more social. And then we'll look at some examples just to give you more ideas and inspiration on how to make social fundraising even more creative for you. And of course, as Heather mentioned, there will be a Q&A in the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and we'll make sure that we answer them in the end. So first of all, why do we want to involve social media in our fundraising campaigns? If you think of it, even when you're starting with a more traditional approach for fundraising, social media can really help us as a nonprofit to go exactly where people are, to go to the channels that people and potentially our supporters are spending most of the time. So this is the way that you want to build a connection. You want to find the purpose and the common interest that they will have to support your cause. And also, you want to help them find the inspiration that they want to find out more about your organization and then ultimately to become your donors. So it is a great opportunity to just explore new creative paths and new ideas in order to find new channels that might be a different inspiration for your organization. And if that sounds quite abstract, sometimes it's not really convincing on the general use of social media, it's really interesting to look at the actual stats and how social media really fits into fundraising. It's useful because when thinking of social media and why we need to involve them in fundraising, it's good to look at the stats. For example, this is from this year's UK fundraising report. 79% of charities said that they see social media as a successful channel for fundraising the last year. This means that a very large number agrees that social media now is becoming an important channel when it comes to fundraising. And it's a good proof when you're examining and you want to get the buy-in with your team to make a case of more nonprofits actually using that. It's also useful because social media is leading to an increased number of donations. So charities said that using social media, 51% of them are more likely to see an increase in donation. So that means that your supporters, they might not be ready yet for a donation, but social media might help them towards that decision. And last but definitely not least, social media inspires giving. According to the Giving Trends report from 2018, social media is the #1 communications tool that inspires giving, even ahead of email and website. That means that if you want to start thinking of your next fundraising campaigns, the fact that social media does inspire giving makes it very appealing in order to make sure that you include the right channels. So now we want to look at all the different ways we can involve social media to your supporter journey. And by supporter journey, we mean anything that pretty much is helping your potential donors or your supporters to get into the actual donation, to actually find out more about your work and get to the end goal, no matter what your objective is. We look at 4 different ways, and it will be a way to pretty much differentiate the different areas on how you can use social media. So we're going to split up between identification, engagement, solicitation, and acknowledgement. Starting with identification. The identification is pretty much the stage that you can make the most of social media, at least for the starting point. You want to raise awareness about your work. You want to reach people that might not necessarily know much about your organization. And that's a great way to use social media because it has a great audience and you want to make sure you find the most relevant ones. That's where you also want to build a relationship with potential donors. You want to find them, connect with them where we are, and then of course to start telling more about your organization. Then it's the stage of engagement. When someone knows more about your work, or at least they're more familiar with your cause, you want to make sure that you want to engage with them. So you want to be a long-lasting relationship in order to stay interested and make the ask at the right time. A good way to do that could be to join awareness days, try to be more engaging and sometimes even more casual on social media. And it's good to keep in mind that social media could be treated as any offline event really, or an engagement activity. When you're going to a dinner or a networking event and you want to make sure that you start a conversation, you wouldn't just start, for example, by promoting your business. You would try to have some chit chat because you want to make sure that you start building a long-lasting relationship. So think of social media as any other engagement activity and trying to find the ways to be more casual before you want to make the right ask at the right time. And speaking of making the ask, this is the stage of solicitation. This is how you can use social media to actually start involving in your fundraising campaign. After having someone familiarized with your work, or when you start engaging with them and show a more casual approach, it's time to make the ask. You decided, for example, to run a fundraising campaign, you want to involve social media, so it's time to tell a story. In this case, you want a strong, direct, and emotive message. And you also want to make sure that you have a balance when you make the fundraising ask, but also when you continue the engagement. You don't want to just use social media to keep asking for donations because people might feel that this is just too much for them. So you want to make sure that your supporters don't feel overwhelmed. You're not repeating the same questions and the same asks. And of course, when you actually make the ask, you want to be as actionable as possible. And then once you actually start the fundraising campaign, you involved social, a very important stage that can actually be very useful is the stage of acknowledgement. You want to make sure that if someone's supporting you on social media, if they're following you, if they liked your post, or of course, if they are a donor, you want to thank them for the contribution. You want to show your appreciation. And it's good to do that sometimes with a more personal approach. There are many examples of nonprofits who actually send individual messages, they send images and videos. But if you feel that you don't have the capacity, you could still create an image, like the example that you see on the screen, and you're thanking your supporters for all the hard work and the contribution. It's a great opportunity to make the most of social media this way compared to other channels, because it doesn't necessarily need to take much time, but it can be a great way for someone to feel closer to your organization. And now we're getting into more specific social media platforms. It's good to talk about the general use of social media for fundraising, but you might be wondering, how can I use the social media platforms more specifically about fundraising? The first platform that probably comes to mind is Facebook. It's obviously the most popular platform, but it's also the first platform that really decided to offer different opportunities in terms of fundraising, especially for nonprofits. So the most obvious option is to add the donate button to your Facebook page. This is an example coming directly from Facebook on what it looks like. And it's a great way for someone who visited your page to make a donation if they feel that they're ready to do that. Another great way that it's not directly related to you is about fundraisers. If someone is supporting your organization, they can decide to run their own fundraiser and raise money for your cause. This has been very popular on Facebook, and there have been many nonprofits who actually benefited from that. And it definitely needs some strategy, but it's also useful if you start understanding how it works. And another interesting way to actually use Facebook in terms of fundraising is to have the live video option. So you could start a live during a fundraising campaign, get your supporters on board, or maybe have a video with your team, tell a story. And at the same time, you do have a donation button for those who actually want to contribute while watching your video. This is actually a great idea, especially if you have some sort of video that you can definitely share and make an impact. And it goes back again to what we've discussed, the idea of engaging your supporters, but also making the ask. So when it comes to Facebook and fundraising and how to involve that in your planning, it's good to remember that you can start by familiarizing yourself with the options. Have a read at Facebook's resources. They have many details on how all the options work, and find what works better for you. You can set up a strategy. For example, how do you want to approach the Facebook donations? Or how do you want to approach the fundraisers if someone else is fundraising for you? And then you want to keep in mind that Facebook is not necessarily your main fundraising channel. Just because Facebook is really investing on new fundraising options and it's really exciting, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to abandon everything that you're doing. Keep going and trying with what you're already doing. Make sure that you do leverage what you're successful, but also start trying out new ideas. Have a think about Facebook and how you can really involve that in your Facebook campaign. Another channel that is also owned by Facebook is Instagram. Instagram is also trying to invest more in nonprofits and donations. So they've launched a few months, might be a year now, the donation sticker. So when you create an Instagram story, you have the option to create a donate sticker, which is pretty much when someone sees your story on Instagram, they can just click on donate and just through their phone proceed to a donation. This is actually very useful because Instagram stories are very engaging. There are more people who actually use them, and it is a great opportunity to actually encourage your supporters to make the most of this channel. What's also interesting with Instagram is that it has been announced that a donate button is coming for the profiles. So the way it works for Facebook, you would just click on an Instagram profile and you would have an option to encourage your supporters to donate directly. So as you can imagine, these two channels are probably the most popular ones on social media because they're really working towards improving the fundraising options, and we're expecting more towards that direction the rest of the year. Another option is Twitter. It might not be the first one that comes to mind because they don't have the direct connection with a donate button, for example, but it's still useful in terms of the supporter journey. So for example, if there's an awareness day that is relevant to your organization, you can start posting the tweets or scheduling in advance and combine the engagement, the awareness, but also the fundraising ask. Another great way is about making the most of Giving Tuesday. It's a hashtag and a day that is actually trending every year. And this year is on the 3rd of December, and it's a big day of giving, probably the biggest day of online giving, which means that Twitter is probably where the conversation is starting, and you want to be part of that if you want to make your fundraising more social. And also, there are other social media channels. There are many social media platforms. Not all of them are always obvious in terms of fundraising, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't try that. YouTube, for example, has a donate button for the last year now. Not many nonprofits use that compared to Facebook, but it's still very popular because obviously YouTube is the most popular video platform. So if you do have enough videos, or if you want to tell a story through your YouTube channel, you can definitely give it a try. And if you want to try new ideas, you can also explore LinkedIn in terms of more professional approach. There might be some brand partnerships, or even if you want with match funding for your campaign, it's just more of a corporate background, but it's still very popular. Pinterest can also be useful in terms of a visual approach to create a board when it comes to your fundraising campaign. And the good thing is that the pins on Pinterest last longer for the time that someone sees that. So you might post something today and someone might come across it, for example, in a couple of weeks' time. So it might not have the same approach with Twitter when something goes really fast, but it might be worth exploring if you feel that it makes sense for your audience. And of course, there are other channels that are more specific, like Snapchat and TikTok. They are more targeting the younger demographics. So if you feel that a campaign really wants to target, for example, young adults, then you should definitely give it a try and find a way to mix that with your strategy. So getting to more practical tips. So how can you make your fundraising more social? First of all, it might be a good idea to create a strategy. You don't need to have a big strategy and you don't need a big team for that. But it's good to create even a one-page document, like the way you would create the marketing strategy, so that you know your objectives and what you want to make out of that, really. You want to set, for example, some team check-ins to create the personas, to understand your target audience, or you might even want to create a plan for your activities. How do you want to make the most of social media? How does fundraising really fit to your planning? The next step, as we've mentioned before with all the social media channels, there are many of them out there, so you want to make sure that you use the right ones. It's probably not the best idea to try to be on all social media channels because there are too many and you probably won't have the time to do that. It's better to aim for 1, 2 channels or even 3 rather than just trying to be on everywhere. So that's where you also want a strategy. Have a think, do you know your target audience? How often do you want to post? And then what's the ideal balance in terms of the posting and your channels? So these are questions that are useful to ask in advance before you start getting more into fundraising, because it's a great way to start understanding your content. It makes it easier for you to understand what you want and what you really want to get out of your campaign. Then you want to tailor your messaging. Let's say you decided that you want to include Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for your fundraising campaign. Then you want to start thinking, how can I make the most of my messaging in a way that it makes sense for every channel? So for example, Twitter is limited in a set number of characters, but on Instagram, you might want to post a long caption. So you want to think of the limitations for every channel and also the opportunities and how you can really adjust your messaging from one channel to another. Another important point that you want to remember, and that applies to all fundraising campaigns in general, is that you want to focus on the impact. When telling your story in your fundraising campaign, you want to make sure that you don't just ask for money, you also highlight the impact of each donation. So a good way to do that is using social media, because you can just share some different posts and share different examples of how each donation can really make a difference. For example, you can also use a channel like Twitter to update everyone on the campaign progress. If you're running a campaign, let's say for just a week, you might want to keep posting and encourage everyone to keep being part of that. So instead of just using emails all the time, you might feel that social media is the right way to do that. And then, of course, you want to involve your supporters. The best part about social media is that you can really create a big community of involved supporters. You want to make sure that they do stay engaged. So you want to create some sort of toolkit that you help them with the messaging. It's very easy sometimes to create a Facebook group or any other community so that your supporters feel more involved and they really feel part of the campaign. It makes it easier to spread the message, and if they are really engaged, sometimes they can just do the job for you. They can keep sharing, they can find their own networks, and it just saves you time instead of being just your organization posting about your campaign. So now let's look at some more practical tips on how to make your fundraising campaign succeed. We're looking at 5 points so that you start thinking when you create a post of all the things you need to keep in mind. First of all, you need to have a call to action. It may sound obvious, but it's useful to remember and ask yourself, how many posts actually have a call to action when you're telling a story? Sometimes we're confused, and when we tell a story, we feel that we don't necessarily need a call to action. It might be true, but if you want to also involve fundraising, then it might be useful to link to a donation page. This is an example from Christian Ed, and they wanted to show that they do support people who stand with them. So this way, they also involved a link to a donation page, and it was a great way to tell a message, to have a great image, but also to make sure that if someone wants to support you, they can follow that link and just make a donation. Then the second tip is about make sure that you do a consider donation ask. When you have a compelling story, it's kind of tempting to just add a donation ask to every single post, but this is not always working for the supporters. So next time you're about to create your social media fundraising posts, think of what your supporters would like to see. It's better to make a very strong ask from one image to another, for example, rather than just have a series of posts asking the same thing. So if you feel that there is one post that would really make a difference, then you want to focus on that. It's definitely better to focus on the quality of the posts rather than just having a big number of posts sending the same message. And as in that case, for example, for Street Child UK, they were asking supporters to donate to their Mind the Gap campaign. And this way they made a compelling ask because donations will be doubled by the government. So when there is a reason and when you want to share an important message, it actually makes the ask even more powerful. The third tip is to consider your supporter journey. As we've mentioned before, social media can be useful in your supporter journey, but you also want to keep that in mind when you're creating the content. A story, and that's any part of a fundraising campaign, should take people on a journey. So the story can be part of many posts, of many channels, but then you need to keep in mind that effective storytelling, it's not just one post. You want to have some sort of supporter journey so that you start with the awareness, you introduce the story, the characters, the problems, but then you also want the actual result. You want the action. And this is usually the ask and the fundraising element to it. Instead of just presenting the problem, you also want to tell the supporters how they can really make a difference, how their contribution can really matter, and how to really try to guide them through the next steps. Because as we've mentioned, if you don't have a call to action to your posts, then you're just not really facilitating the journey and how they can really make a donation. So think of all the different stages that someone would want to see from your posts and how to really make your fundraising more facilitated to the social media posting. Then it's time to think of the visual content. And the fourth tip is about making the most of the images and videos in a way that they drive action. So as you can see from this example, there is a strong message which is in the copy, and there is also a link to the donation page. But as we know from social media, it's usually the visual content that drives the attention. So when you actually scroll on your feed on Facebook or Instagram, it's usually the image that grabs your attention. So in this example, for example, from Women's Aid, they just created a simple image. It looks like an image that you could just create very fast with online tools. And they made sure that they add the message, help us support more women to escape abuse. So even if that's not powerful enough, they also made sure that they do mention donate today. Sometimes it's very obvious, but if we do mention the call to action, it makes it way more powerful. So have a think. Next time you're about to create your posts on what would really grab someone's attention. Even the first impact can really make a change. And then, as we mentioned earlier, make sure you involve your supporters. It could be in many different forms. You could have a community online, for example, it could be a Facebook group, but you could also encourage them to share their own content. User-generated content can be very useful because it just saves you time from your own content, and it also makes the campaign more authentic. So when you create, for example, your next campaign, you want to make sure that your supporters know about this beforehand, and they can also share their own experiences. This is a great example from Time to Change. It's about World Mental Health Day, and they also ask the supporters in the end of the messaging to share their own tips. So now we're going to look at some examples, just to give you a bit of ideas of how social media can really fit into fundraising. This was a very interesting example, and there are different ones, but they still have the same idea behind it. It's pretty much making the most of Facebook fundraising in a more creative way. In both the ads, you see the message is to encourage people to donate for their birthday. So instead of just sharing the message on your Facebook page, both of these organizations decided to create Facebook ads. They wanted to target those who have their birthdays quite soon. And the great thing about Facebook is that the targeting can be very detailed. So in that case, they just filtered those who have birthdays, for example, in the next month. And these people saw the ads in their feeds, and in case they're already following the organization, they have more chances to support them. So this is a great way to have an indirect approach to fundraising, so it doesn't come necessarily from you, but it's a great way to motivate your supporters to actually be part of that and feel more inspired to learn more about your organization and create their own fundraisers. This is a campaign from WWF, and it was on Snapchat. As we've mentioned, you don't necessarily need to try all the big channels. If you feel that there is a specific channel that makes more sense for your organization, then you can definitely give it a try. So WWF wanted to promote their campaign with the hashtag #LastSelfie, and they also made sure that they involved a phone number so people text to donate. And what was clever in that idea was that they chose Snapchat because they felt that the urgency about the appeal of the campaign and the last selfie made more sense for Snapchat because they would just self-destruct after 10 seconds. So this symbolized pretty much the animal's extinction from the earth, and it made really big sense in that way. And in order to make it more powerful, they decided to use the other social media channels and bring them all back to Snapchat. So they wanted to involve more than one channel, which is a great way to bring your supporters together. But they also have one main messaging, and they made sure that it does make sense, linking the social media platform and the actual message. And this is from WaterAid, and it was on Instagram. It's making the most of Instagram stories and the donate sticker. What was useful, it was the fact that you don't necessarily need to spend too much time when creating content. As you can see, it's just a very simple way to make the most of stories. Stories are very engaging, and you don't need to create a really complicated image. You just ask everyone to donate to encourage their friends to spread the word. And you're making it even easier. You're just telling them that they just need to click on the donation sticker, they pick the organization, and just like that, they donate to the cause. So it's a very simple approach, but it can also be very effective. And it just reminds us that we don't necessarily need to make a very big social media strategy. Sometimes even thinking of an engaging way to connect with the supporters can be very useful. So just some takeaways of all the different things that we've discussed. What have we learned today? It's good to remember that social media, like any fundraising and marketing channel, needs some sort of strategy beforehand. You need to make sure that you understand your audience so that you know the right time you spend on a channel and how you're going to post in order to be effective. We've mentioned 5 key tips to make sure your fundraising ask isn't diluted. So pretty much as a reminder, you want to make sure that you do have a call to action, that it's very actionable, but also you make sure that you have a balance. You want to use social media also as an engagement technique. You want to keep your supporters more interested and more invested, because at the end of the day, you want to keep them interested in the longer term. You don't want to just make them part of one campaign and then make them feel that they don't really have anything else to offer. So think of them as the bigger picture and try to use social media as the medium to actually keep them engaged for the upcoming campaigns for the next years. And keep in mind, make sure you have a fundraising journey mapped out so that you make sure that you involve social media. Email and any other comms can be great, but if you realize that more people are spending time on social, then you want to make sure that all the channels somehow come together. You don't want to have a social media strategy just for social and then, for example, ignore the other comms. It should come from a comms plan, and you need to make sure that everyone who's working on different areas are really supporting you in that. And then just keep in mind that the strategy can be great, but then at the end of the day, you want to test and learn. So don't be afraid to try out new ideas, to see what works in terms of the channels or even the messaging. And then based on your results, keep trying and stick to that what works for you. We might be talking about one channel, but then you realize that actually something else makes more sense for you. So just because the stats and the best practices are leading you towards one way, it doesn't mean that you can try something else. And in terms of how we can help, and Heather mentioned that a bit in the beginning, we can help you with Lightful and the social media platform in terms of being more strategic with social media and fundraising. One of the reasons we created the social media platform is that we kept hearing from charities and nonprofits that it's really hard to find the connection between social media and fundraising. So pretty much we made sure that the first social media platform for nonprofits is having the option to actually build your own stories, to help you with the right templates, and of course, make sure that you collaborate with your team. So when you're ready to plan your social media posts, you want to make sure that you involve your teams, you could involve your volunteers, and make sure that everyone has a say in telling your story. They don't necessarily need to access your own social media platforms, but if they can share their own ideas or if they can contribute somehow, then that's a great benefit for your next campaign. And in terms of getting some templates, which is pretty much some inspiration for your next campaign, we've built some brand new templates. There are storytelling templates about your next campaigns, for example, Giving Tuesday, Christmas, or any end of year appeal. Instead of start thinking, what should I post next and how many posts do I need or what's the ideal frequency for my posts, you could just try one template, find some suggested content, check some posts and some inspiration, and then edit anything that works for your organization. These are all free, and I'll also make sure I include the links in the follow-up email in case you want to find out more. And now it's time for questions. And of course, I try to cover many different things, but I also wanted to make sure I hear more from you and anything specific that you want to talk more about. So feel free to tell me more at the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you, Teresa. I love the fast-moving, practical, how-to, useful webinars. Wonderful.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right, so we have a number of questions here. Let me get my notes ready. So one person was asking what you thought about the difference between the audience or the demographics of Facebook users and the audience and demographics of those on Twitter.
Good question. So Facebook, according to the usual demographics that we see on reports, tends to be more older people lately compared to Twitter. Twitter is more about those who feel that they want fast-paced information. So someone is on Twitter for a different reason than Facebook. They might be the same people, but those on Facebook are coming with more of a personal approach. They usually go on Facebook to check their friends, their family, and pretty much the updates. But when you go on Twitter, you go with a different mindset. So you could have a more personal storytelling approach on Facebook, but on Twitter, you might share more details, you might make more of a fun approach, or try some authentic ideas. And sometimes when you want to think of this, it's also useful to think of the big brands and how they approach social media. Of course, they're not really relevant to the nonprofits, but it's always a good tip to try to see the creative approach and how they're really using different channels. So you don't necessarily need a big budget the way they do. But as you can see, sometimes on Twitter, they're funnier, they're more creative, or they're just engaging with their followers. Or on Facebook, you might try more videos. So it's more of the approach necessarily on the content and how these can change.
Excellent. How can small nonprofits, the million-dollar question, how can small nonprofits grow their following on social media?
I hear this question quite often. I think the usual answer to this is make sure that you are consistent. It sounds very general, but it's really easy when we feel overwhelmed or if we have too many things to do to post for a few days and then just forget that. So it does take time, and social media platforms are growing in a way that they don't really encourage you to just acquire, for example, fake followers and feel that you've done some progress. So it's better to be consistent and focus on the slow growth, but actually also pay attention to the engagement. So instead of thinking that I want to increase just the followers, you also want to make sure that those who are following you, they also are seeing the interaction. They enjoy your content and they also want to find out more about you.
Excellent. How about Amazon Smile? I'm not even, do they have that in the UK? How would you incorporate Amazon Smile into fundraising social media campaigns?
Yes, it has actually been introduced to the UK quite recently. I'm sure it will be longer in the US. It's an
Mhm.
interesting channel, and I think it's pretty much the case that there are new ideas coming up, and we should definitely embrace that, but not in a way that we leave everything out behind. If we
Yeah.
feel that there is an opportunity, even with some sort of tiny increase in the donations, then of course you should embrace that.
Okay, give me 3 seconds. I'm sorry, my dog's barking. Hold on. All right, I have a question for you. In your
Sure.
presentation, you showed a Facebook post by Christian Aid, and it
Yes.
was an image, and it said 43% of children under the age of 5 in India are malnourished. So
Yes.
this is a strategy that's been around a while, using images for inspirational quotes and statistics. Since you've been on social media for a while, do you see that those still work well, or are they fading? Is it getting better?
I still see the images. As you've said, they've been around for a while. And I think it depends on the occasion. If you add too many things and too many messages in your images, then yes, it can be distracting. Or if you're trying way too hard to get into the emotion, people might feel that that doesn't really resonate with me. So I
Yeah.
think people are becoming more cautious on social media. So you need to make sure that you're really authentic. It could still work, but you need to make sure that it makes sense with what you're posting and your whole messaging.
Okay, great. And Danielle is asking, is there a certain writing tone that you think works well for a call to action or a fundraising ask? So it's more than just asking for money.
That's a really great question. I've actually never heard that question again, so I really like that. I think the tone of voice really depends on the messaging of your campaign. So we see many campaigns try to tap into the urgency, for example. So when there's an appeal and there's a crisis, you obviously make it sound more that you really have to help right now. But we've also seen campaigns with a more authentic approach and more casual, more warm, actually, in order to make sure that you do tap into the right emotions. It definitely has to do with trying different ideas. But I'd say anything that comes out as authentic from your organization can be appreciated. You don't need to necessarily follow the guidelines of what others are doing.
Okay. And what's happening over in the UK with TikTok? Have you seen any good examples there of nonprofits using TikTok, or here in the United States or in Australia, anywhere?
So to be fair, TikTok is really at a very beginner's level in terms of the nonprofits. And even with brands, they're still trying out new ideas. There are some big brands that do see the benefits. But I only added TikTok at this stage, especially for next year, because I think earlier in this year, it was the most downloaded social media app in the App Store, which means that more people now are trying that. It's not yet at the stage that we have all the examples to showcase great success stories. But if we see that it's growing, for example, in the next 6 months, it might be something to even try on our own just to understand how it works and then start trying some ideas. It's definitely not the primary social media channel for our strategy.
Okay. And of the social media that's out there, what are the top two that you recommend for nonprofits?
In terms of fundraising, I'd say Facebook and Instagram, in the sense that they're really trying to invest more features and time in the fundraising options. So the idea of having a donate button or running fundraisers can be great. You can also motivate all your supporters to be part of that. And they seem to be in a great direction, and hopefully there are more things to come in the next year.
Okay, great. Do you have any thoughts on like social advertising? So purchasing ads on Facebook, since we're kind of losing the battle with the newsfeed algorithm. I mean, have you found that nonprofits are willing now to boost a post for 10 US dollars, or they're still just, we're not spending any money? What's your take on nonprofits, particularly small nonprofits, having to invest in Facebook
Yes.
or Twitter advertising?
I think it's a really great question. And as we see the organic clicks becoming harder, especially on Facebook, it's something that more nonprofits are interested in. And usually my answer to that is try out for a very small budget. You don't necessarily need to invest a big budget. And it's certainly good in terms of understanding your audience. Or if you want an idea like the one we've shown earlier on tapping into the birthdays and how can someone really support you. So if someone who's already a Facebook fan, but they don't see all your organic posts, if you create an ad, for example, for $10, $20, as you've said, and you're appealing to those who already follow you and those who actually have birthday next month, then that means that you're really increasing your chances for someone to fundraising for you.
Yes.
So the $10 or $20 that you're using for the ad, you might get a way bigger investment from that. So it's definitely something to try out without necessarily having a big budget on that.
Excellent. All right, here's a question. Let's say you have a social media fundraiser and it's got a hashtag, it's a campaign. What is an ideal time length for a social media campaign?
That's a great question. I think we've seen many examples. For example, we have Giving Tuesday, which is just one day. So if you want a very quick campaign that is very intensive, you could still do that even on one day. But in general, I think you need 1 week or an even longer period so that you start telling the story. But you also need to keep in mind that you don't want this to run too long, for example, 2 months, because this way it gets a bit repetitive and it doesn't really count as a campaign. So for me, it would be a period of time of a week or 10 days, but it still depends on your content and if you're able to keep supporting that.
I've got a question for you. Here in the US, email is a big driver of online donations or sending out an email saying like us on Facebook. I mean, email's still incredibly powerful. Is that the case in the UK?
Yes, it is. And that's exactly what I was thinking earlier in terms of connecting all your channels. Because we know social media sometimes is not the main driver of the income, but if someone is following you both on social and they already subscribed to your newsletter, they might see something on social and then be convinced through email. So what you really need in that case is to make sure that all your channels are consistent. It's not just about focusing on one and forgetting the other.
Okay, great. Here's a question I know you're going to love. Automation software platforms work best for scheduling posts for nonprofits?
That's a great question. Well, I think it works in the sense of saving time, which is obviously a case that when we feel we have too many things to do, it's useful to have a platform to just bring everything together. For example, every Monday, you just schedule your posts for the rest of the week, and you just come back to engage with the community. So in that sense, yes, it's very useful. But we've seen sometimes that if you want to use a platform directly, like Facebook, it might be more useful to just go there, post a video, and get done. So if you want to have a strategy or a planning in mind, then yes, I would say social media scheduling platforms and anything that's automated is useful.
Yeah. You know, I never used to do that, but I do it now, and it makes my life.
It saves time. I've seen that with me too.
Yeah. I'm curious. I've never seen it, come across it anywhere. Have you ever seen any data on how much money is being raised through Instagram donate stickers or even YouTube giving tools? They've never released any data on this. Have you seen anything?
I was wondering the same thing when I was mentioning the different platforms. I Googled that quite a bit, but I didn't find anything, unfortunately. Yeah. I'm sure they should be on Instagram soon, but I didn't find anything on YouTube, which was really strange.
And by the way, there's a woman on the webinar named Stacy. She sent a link. I can't click to it right now, but she said the actual Instagram donate buttons on profiles were just launched.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yeah, so that's great.
That's coming very soon. That's perfect.
In real time as we speak.
Good to know.
And there was another person. If you could go back to slide 38, I believe it is. There were 5 tips, or 5 tips maybe before that. I can't remember. Maybe go. Sorry. There. What was number 2?
Number 2. This one.
There you go.
Yes.
All right. Cross that question off the list. We've got 2 more. Folks, if you want to ask any questions, now would be the time. Danielle says, this was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Danielle.
With people's news feeds being overrun with so much information, which we all live with every day now, Do you have any other tips on how nonprofits can stand out from the clutter?
That's a great question. I think it really depends on your objectives. How do you want to use social media? Because as you've said, for example, Facebook can be very overwhelming because you're not really making the most of the organic reach. So if you feel that your audience is not really engaging, it's just to decide, do I want to boost, to promote my posts, or is there another channel that is making more sense for me? And then it's also about keeping in touch with the latest social media trends. For example, Instagram and Facebook work very well with videos and live content. So you want to make sure that in order to stand out, it's obviously hard because you always need to keep track of all these, but it does help to keep an eye on the things, how they change, how social media platforms are working, and what really works in the end for you. If there's one channel that works better, then you can just stick to that.
Great. I can tell you have a lot of experience. And once somebody has been on social media a lot, you just kind of intuitively start to understand how it works.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Okay. So one last question, because my dog, I have to feed him like 12 treats to just get through this Q&A. Do you have any tips on how often to post on each platform per day?
That's a great question. So there is a guideline in terms of that, but again, takes it with a pinch of salt because it does depend on your own schedule. So just in general, on Facebook, there is a suggestion of 3 to 4 posts a week as a guideline. You don't need too many posts, but you don't want to post just once a month. On Twitter, you can post way more frequently. For example, even 3 to 5, 7 tweets a day is perfectly fine because the tweets go faster and you can have more. On LinkedIn, you might post 2, 3 posts a week, and it's perfectly fine. Even 1 post a week is great because posts on LinkedIn last longer. In terms of Instagram, it depends on your content. If you have many images, even once a day is great. Because I was reading lately that if you're able to post once a day on Instagram, the way the algorithm works, it's great, but you do need the images. And then again, it depends on the other channels and what you're using. For example, YouTube videos, depends on how often you have content.
All right, I think that's a perfect answer. I agree with you 100% on that.
Oh, great. Good to hear that.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. I did want to let you know, again, that this webinar was recorded. And Teresa, it's almost 7 o'clock, so my guess is she's going home. But when she gets to work in the morning, she'll probably start putting it together.
Yes,
and
I'm doing that.
Send out a set of notes and a link to the recording within 24 to 48 hours.
Yes, that's true.
All right.
Great. Thanks so much.
Anything with you?
Oh, good. Great.
All good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your
Bye.
day or evening.